Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
This week, we're going to talk about Intune and Entra. If you're not aware, Microsoft has documentation every month that talks about new features in all of the different solutions that we have. Intune, Entra, which is identity, also the Defender products as well. Tonight, we're just going to talk about Intune and Entra because there's a lot. And trust me, I don't always have time to read through every month what's new because there are always things that are coming out. And all of this stuff also gets published within the admin center in the message center. So when you're going through the message center, there's usually links to these blogs as well. We've talked about keeping up with the message center if you're an admin to make sure that you're staying up, because a lot of times, as we'll find out tonight, there is going to be features that go generally available, and then there's going to be default values that are set that will have impact on your organization if you don't disable them or do something about it. So let's talk about some of the things that are new with Intune. The first one, which has been a long-awaited feature, is MAM, which is Mobile Application Management on Windows. MAM is not anything new. It's been around for a very long time with iOS and Android. And that's the ability to control at the app level without having to enroll the device your organization data and prevent things like cut and paste or creating a PIN to access like email within Outlook. So essentially, in layman's terms, encrypting at the app level, if you will, encrypting your org's data and requiring some level of compliance without having to enroll the device. You can even do things like prevent a jailbroken or rooted device to access your information without having to actually enroll the device into Intune, into full MDM. So now we have the ability to do that on Windows via Edge. Edge for Business as the new term for Edge that is integrating with your identity provider, Azure Active Directory. And this was a concert of effort between the Edge team, the identity team, the Intune team, and the Defender team in order to come up with this feature. And I'm sure they are working very hard to also provide this eventually for Linux and for Mac. But right now, it's in public preview for Windows, and you're going to get that ability to scope policies for your data on Windows, very similar to the way that it works on iOS and Android today. So you can prevent things like cut and paste. You can also look at the risk level of the device, and if the risk level is higher, you can block the user from accessing org data. You can also check to make sure that there's encryption, there is an updated antivirus agent, signatures, all of that. So the ability to manage and protect your org data without having to fully enroll the device into Intune, so people can check things on their personal devices and not have it enrolled into management. Really cool feature.
I was surprised to see this on the rundown, Andy, because this has been a long time coming, to be fair. I know we've been talking about this, I think, all the way back to when Brad Anderson was still with the company, which dates it a bit because Brad's been gone for some time now. But this is, and by the way, Brad did not pass away. He went to Qualtrics, but we definitely miss Brad. He was awesome, a great face for our EMS capabilities. This is really great. We always talk about the proverbial grandma's PC scenario. You're at Thanksgiving. The only computer there is grandma's old Windows 10 PC that has barely been updated in a couple of years, and you have to get to some business critical document because you're in the woods and there's no cellular data or whatever, and you got to get some work done, but your organization only wants to allow that if it can be guaranteed to be secure. And so this is essentially using the browser to wrap that protective layer around company data, accessing things like Outlook on the web or Word on the web, and letting you work within the confines of the browser, but not allowing data exfiltration outside of the browser to other unmanaged applications. So definitely worth checking out. If you're not familiar with the capabilities on iOS or Android, they've been around literally my entire time at Microsoft, so 6+ years. They're super mature. They're really great. They're also data loss prevention capabilities too. I used to demo this frequently, and I referred to it as the circle of trust, kind of borrowing from Meet the Parents, where I could open a document in Outlook in my work context, and I could pass that document to Word, and again, this is all on iOS or Android, and open it there, but then I can't pass it to an unmanaged, a non-managed application like a Dropbox or a Google Drive, as an example. I can't copy paste outside of those apps. It's very cool. And so this is now bringing that to Windows with the Edge browser. So very, very cool stuff. I'm really excited to see this finally in public preview. Like Andy said, it took multiple teams working together to deliver this. So I'm really excited to see this come out. And honestly, I want to kick the tires on it myself. I have not yet had a chance to do that. And just as a programming note, as always, Andy and I both do work for Microsoft. And so we always like to call that out on the show whenever we're talking about technologies that our company works on behalf of. But we thought these are just some interesting updates that admins should be aware of that are coming to Microsoft 365 environments near you.
And speaking of kicking the tires on this feature, most of the time when things go into public preview, they just get added to your tenant and you're able to take a look at them, especially if you have that toggle for preview features enabled or want to partake in preview features. For this particular one, you have to actually notify them to essentially onboard your tenant if you're interested. So if you go to the blog post, which we'll have a link in the show notes for, there's a link in that blog, in the technical community blog, that passes you over to a Microsoft form, which then says, what is your name, what is your company, what's your position, and what is your tenant that you would like to add to this public preview, which I thought was interesting because, again, most of the time features just get added, but I went ahead and submitted my demo tenant to get onboarded, so hopefully I will get a chance to take a look at it. But if you're interested, make sure you go to that blog post and submit your company to get onboarded into the tenant.
And just one more point on the subject before we move on. I find you will be more successful if you are curious about this stuff. If you're willing to, let's try it out. Let's see how it works. Let's figure out how it works. As opposed to wait for that to be spoon-fed to you. So I find the most successful customers that I work with are the ones who are innately curious. And when stuff lights up in their tenant, as opposed to freaking out and figuring out how fast they can shut it down, they instead immediately scope it to a couple of IT admins and they start trying it out, figuring out how it works. Those are the customers that are most successful. So be curious, not judgmental, and give it a shot.
Another thing that's coming to Intune is improved management for Windows drivers and firmware updates. Something that, again, has long been asked for from many customers. And so there's going to be a new driver update management policy and reports built right into Intune and will be available with Windows Enterprise. So it is limited to our enterprise customers, but these new policies will have things like intelligent servicing to identify available driver updates, granular controls for deployment, like the ability to pause a specific driver. You'll have the ability to manage manual or optional drivers, detail reporting for monitoring device status, and recommendations for remediation. And you'll be able to manage these policies either through Intune or Windows Auto Patch. So depending on how your company is patching, but really great features that are coming because I think Windows Update has been fairly mature and for most companies, but driver and firmware usually lag behind. Usually you don't see drivers and firmware get updated until there's a major issue and the device comes in and like, when was the last time you wiped your computer and started from scratch? And when they do that, that's when they start updating drivers and firmware. So I think this is a really good way for admins, device management admins, to get a hold of not only reporting. You'll be able to see what drivers and firmwares are out of date on your devices, but then an ability to update those through Intune.
Security professionals have a vested interest in both of these, significantly so. Drivers are, of course, a very common attack vector for initial compromise, and so you want to see those updated. And firmware, I think, is a underreported and perhaps not well enough understood how much of a risk vector that can be as well. And I have talked to customers who have straight up told me, we don't do field firmware updates, period. Firmware updates only happen when we have it sitting on our bench because we don't trust them to be reliable enough. And that, frankly, is borderline terrifying. And driver updates, I think, also many customers are very immature on as well. And that's a huge threat vector. So this is an opportunity to really improve and adopt modern management practices to get those both deployed, because let's just be honest, in 2023, having an attitude of, unless we have physical, access to the device, we don't do this thing, is a broken model. You can't operate on that model. It's not scalable. So you have to be able to deploy these sorts of things in the field rapidly and quickly, or you're going to put your whole organization at risk of either already large attack vectors or growing attack vectors. So no, you as a security defender, you may not be directly responsible for what you see as drudgery of like endpoint management. However, you have a vested interest in making sure they're successful with this. So might be a good question to go ask your endpoint management team. Are you looking at this? Are you adopting this? How do you update firmware today? How do you update drivers today? And if they're not on the right path, keep asking questions, keep pulling that thread on what's it going to take? How can InfoSec help encourage you to get to this model?
So let's pivot to Entra, which is Microsoft's identity. Mm-hmm. There's a few things that are new. The June blog post hasn't actually come out, so some of the stuff is for May, but still I found some new information when I read through it, and I was like, okay, well, this is interesting. So let's talk about some of the things that were in the May update. First and foremost, authentication strengths for conditional access is now generally available. Woo-hoo. Was in preview for a while, but it is now in general availability, so you can go ahead and scope it. If you're one of those like customers or organizations that says, I don't want to dabble in preview, I don't want to deploy preview features, which is fair because not all preview features actually make it to general availability. In fact, many don't. And so it is fair that you don't want to do anything in prod that is in preview. So great news is this is now generally available. You should go and scope some authentication strengths for conditional access. And this is a control against MFA bombing, something that we've talked about many times, where you'll be able to phish that MFA factor either through, forcing the user to just accept it after getting so many prompts, or maybe calling them on the phone and saying, hey, I just sent an MFA prompt, you should accept it. So authentication strengths, you can have one for, say, phish resistant, and then you can scope a conditional access for a very sensitive application or a very sensitive user. In order to access it, they have to use a phish resistant MFA, like a FIDO2 token or something else. And then for less sensitive things, you can scope even less sensitive or less phish resistant or non-phish resistant, or whatever you want to call it, like an SMS text plus password or something else. So really good because if you do want your sensitive users and applications to be protected with phish resistant MFA.
I made a woohoo when you first started talking about this, Andy, because this is another feature like that MAM for Edge on Windows that has been a long time coming. This is another thing. I was talking about this when I was in your role that you have now, Andy. So over 27 months ago, I remember talking about, hey, we're working on this thing. It's going to let you pick different levels of authentication strength to get access to a thing. And that's going to be awesome when that day comes. Well, this is a big deal. This is really, really pretty big, because for the longest time, in Azure Active Directory, the control you've had is require multi-factor authentication. And so anything that was multi-factor or considered to be multi-factor satisfied that requirement. So that could be something as weak as getting an SMS text message, with a one-time passcode. That was considered just as good as a FIDO2 token. And we know those are not created equal. So this is awesome. I love the idea of being able to target different things. For example, maybe to get to your HR information, your Workday profile, you may have to use a phish-resistant method, Windows Hello for Business, FIDO2 token. And maybe for other things, you could use less secure MFA methods just to get to your run-of-the-mill SharePoint or whatever. So this is huge. This is a long time coming. General availability means everyone can go and leverage this now. So please do start to create that separation. And this could be a good impetus, if you have not done so, to start moving your users to stronger authentication methods as well, and start treating them in a dissimilar fashion, because now you have the technology to do so. And so that gives you kind of that push you need as an admin to really start upping your game from an authentication strength perspective. And absolutely, now that you can move to those phish-resistant methods, you no longer have the risk of that MFA bombing type attack where the attacker just keeps sending prompts over and over and says, well, eventually they'll accept. And usually people do. So great stuff.
Two other kind of interesting features that went generally available that I found I wanted to talk about. Number one, admins are now able to restrict users from self-servicing accessing their BitLocker keys. And the second one is admins can restrict their users from creating tenants. Now, the BitLocker key one is interesting because in general, if you're enrolling your devices within Intune and escrowing the keys within Azure AD, the users are usually able to access within the device settings when they sign into their page and see what devices are signed in with their Azure AD credentials. You're able to see the BitLocker keys and self-service them in case there's like a firmware update and then they need the BitLocker key to unlock it or something like that, or some other issue comes up. That is usually a benefit as well as a time saver for help desk, because that can, create tickets and create downtime and whatnot. Similar to self-service password reset, where users are able to do it on their own without having to involve help desk staff and tying them up on something as easy as getting their BitLocker key. However, of course, there is a risk if that user becomes compromised and an attacker can gain access to those BitLocker keys. And if they have physical access to the device, then they have the BitLocker key to unlock it. So, or if they take that hard drive out or something like that. So there is a risk. I think it's pretty low, but I believe this probably went in as a feature because there are organizations who are asking to restrict this ability. So now you can block your non-admin users from accessing BitLocker keys. And
I bet it's a regulatory thing. It could be a regulatory requirement. Usually when there's some sort of dumb thing where it's like, who needs this? It's some regulation, but that's
could be like,
what? Go ahead.
No, that makes sense. Could be like the federal government or something like that, right?
Sure. Yeah. In general, I would not recommend you turn this on unless you have like a regulatory requirement to do so, which is a phrase I find myself saying to customers regularly, where they'll ask me about a thing and I will basically say, unless you have a regulatory requirement forcing you to do this, don't do this, please.
Right.
And Andy, you've been on those calls with me too, where we've both kind of said stuff like that. Like, regulation is the only time you should use this.
Makes sense. Yeah. The second one about admins being able to restrict their users from creating tenants. If you're not aware, any user within your tenant can create another tenant and kind of tie it back as like a subtenant. You're still signing in with your organizational credentials. Like for Microsoft, for example, when I sign into my Microsoft account and I'm signed into that account, I have access to the Microsoft tenant. Of course, I'm limited because I'm not an admin within the Microsoft.com tenant. However, I actually haven't checked, but up until recently, I'm able to just create another tenant anytime I want to. It doesn't have to be a Microsoft.com tenant. It would be like my own personal tenant. I would have access to Azure with it. I could be an admin within that tenant, but it is still tied to my Microsoft account tenant as well. So there's the ability to switch between tenants, almost like you're a guest, but you can be an admin for those tenants. So this could be an issue because there could be some shadow IT going on. And this has always been a thing if you weren't aware. I remember on the pre-show here, Adam, you were like, I didn't know that this was always a thing. And now you have the ability to restrict it, which I do think this is a good idea. Like, probably should limit your users from being able to create other tenants that are linked to your org tenant.
I was a subject matter expert in our identity platform for 4 years and did not know this was a thing. So in case, listener, you ever feel bad that you don't know it all, even if you're getting paid to know it all, you can't know it all. You know, you're always got to be in that learning mode.
The final thing that I think is a really great thing that is new for Entra is general availability for Authenticator Lite. This went public preview, I think, at the end of April. So it was a very short public preview period and now already generally available. So what Authenticator Lite is the ability to get an MFA prompt within your Outlook app and not have the authenticator be the prompt. So for users who just want to install Outlook and get MFA for that, and they don't want to have to install another authenticator, they can use the Outlook app to do this. If you are a Google user, you may be familiar with this experience in the fact that, like, if you sign into your Google account, it may ask you to open up your YouTube app on your phone and, you know, allow the MFA prompt through there because they know you're signed in there. And so that's already authenticated and they can use that as an authenticator prompt. So similar thing here. If you're already signed into Outlook and then you sign into like Outlook.com, you can get the MFA prompt within your Outlook app. Really important note, there were some conflicting dates within the documentation. I think the documentation team hasn't updated it. One of them said June 9th, the other one said June 26th. So I'm going to give you the June 26th date because that actually is tomorrow. But you should go and check this setting. So it's within Azure AD, authentication methods, the Microsoft Authenticator. When you go into that and you hit configure, all the way at the bottom is the Authenticator Lite. And it's default set to something called Microsoft Managed. And the important thing was the June 26th date, which is the one I'm going to give you, because I think that's the right one, but who knows. If you leave it to Microsoft Managed, it used to be disabled. But on June 26th, the Microsoft Managed value will be changed from disabled to enabled. So if you don't distinctly go and change it to disabled, this will be an enabled feature, which may have some impact on your users if they don't have the authenticator installed and you're requiring MFA. They may start getting MFA prompts through the Outlook app and you may get some questions. So I know how most orgs work, any impact to users, and they start getting help desk questions and whatnot, and that starts to create, kind of a downhill effect. So make sure you check this setting. If you don't want this turned on, go ahead and set it to disabled, or you can set a group of test users or groups, just like your IT admins or something like that, to test. So make sure you go and check that setting after you hear this podcast tomorrow, or a week from now.
This is good stuff. I think of, even with my Yahoo account, I get prompts through my fantasy football app. The more ways users have to receive it, the easier we make that transition to modern and more secure methods of multi-factor authentication. And really the goal here is to move users away from telephony-based authentication models like SMS or phone call. And in fact, another update that's coming soon, I'm not sure the exact enforcement date for that one, is there had previously been the option to set a default authentication method per user. So I could elect and say, well, I prefer you send me an SMS text message. That is going to go away, and it's going to default to the most secure method just automatically. Now, users will always have the option to choose a different one, but that default behavior of I put in username, I put in password, okay, here's a push, go. That's going to default automatically to the strongest method in the future, as opposed to letting the user select one. So I feel like that ties in with this change, and this change is happening first to get users prepared to receive those, in case you have users who still haven't installed the Authenticator app, as an example, but maybe have the Outlook app installed. So overall, this is a positive change. You may need to prepare for the change in doing some user education or maybe some help desk documentation. So that's a great thing to go out and accomplish. However, I think overall, this is something you'll want to roll with and you'll want to have in your environment, because again, the more we can all do to limit and eliminate these telecom-based models of multi-factor authentication is a good thing for all of us. And I think if you've been paying attention recently, you've noticed that our employer, Microsoft, has taken a little bit of a harder stance on some changes with the identity platform, because they move the security posture of the platform forward so dramatically. It was a couple months ago now that number matching became enforced by default. And it was the new modern number matching model where you actually had to type in the numbers. So it may pop up 86 and you actually have to push 86 enter for it to work. And that is a huge improvement too, and also reduces the risk of MFA bombing. So I think you've seen we get enough feedback from customers, enough customers have had difficulties, that we can leverage our position as the largest enterprise identity platform in the world for good and make changes that will help secure everyone better, and all enterprises benefit from it. So I understand if you feel like these changes catch you flat-footed, and what you can do to be better prepared for them. And I give this advice frequently anytime we're talking about impacting changes, is leverage the Planner integration with the Microsoft 365 Message Center. This flows all of the messages from Message Center into Planner. Every message becomes a task. A task is something you can assign to your system owners. This is for our identity owner. This is for our endpoint owner. This is for our email owner. And that way they have a chance to review and make sure they understand. And when they do that check mark for completion, that kind of acts as an audit trail to say, hey, if you weren't prepared for this change, then why did you mark that as completed? So it creates accountability as well, as opposed to kind of that Reservoir Dogs, everyone pointing guns at each other kind of moment. So definitely something you can get a handle on and get on top of and make it just part of your regular practice, as opposed to being caught flat-footed in the future. And I know, we get the customer feedback all the time. You don't like us to do this. I understand that. And sometimes you have to balance that need versus the need of securing the platform and making sure it's a secure place for enterprises to function. And sometimes that need just overwhelms the ability to let everyone kind of do it at their own pace, because sometimes your own pace leaves open risk to the bad guys, and we just have to move faster. So it's always a balancing act, and we certainly understand and try to manage that as best we can. But I think these are all really positive changes, and overall changes that with just a little bit of coaching to your help desk, you can absorb and manage pretty easily.
That's our show for this week. Thanks for listening and watching. As always, our contact information will be in the show notes if you have any questions or future topics you want us to talk about. Thanks, and we'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.